It's a real pleasure to introduce our keynote, and I think we'd all like to thank TAPRA for this opportunity to talk about our work. All of us had the pleasure and privilege of working with David Bradby, and it's a particular honour to receive an award in his name. I think David would have approved of a research project on amateur theatre. He always had a mischievous sense of fun and understood the value of community. Our book, The Ecologies of Amateur Theatre, arose from two AHRC-funded research projects. The first, Amateur Dramatics, Crafting Communities in Time and Space, aimed to address three key questions. We wanted to know how amateur theatre contributes to sustaining, challenging and revitalising communities. We were interested in the social, cultural significance of amateur dramatics as a craft, as a creative practice, as entertainment and as heritage. And we're interested in how amateur dramatics illuminates questions of time, and what we meant by that was work time, leisure time, the longevity of amateur theatre companies, and amateur theatre as a lifelong commitment. We were also interested in challenging stereotypes and in questioning exactly what kind of contribution amateur theatre makers make to the cultural landscape and the creative economy. We were interested in what happens in community settings where theatre making is not regarded as a cultural intervention by professionals. To kind of help this along, we each chose to work on three case studies. I worked on amateur theatre in the Garden City movement and in suburbia. Jane?
I worked on villages in the southwest.
And Nadine, I think, had the plump one.
I worked on amateur theatre groups in the Royal Navy.
So these case studies served to kind of flesh out some of these questions. And we discovered in the process that the boundaries between amateur theatre and professional theatre and community theatres was rather more porous than we'd first suggested. So our second grant for Love or Money, collaboration between amateur and professional theatres, addressed this head on. We worked in partnership with the Royal Shakespeare Company and with their Open Stages programme as a case study. And we asked some questions about how these different sectors interact and raising questions about how they benefit from each other, which we found to be really interesting. I don't think any of us were quite ready for what we discovered in our research, and we hope to convey some of that in this keynote. But I think we'd like to acknowledge the support of the HRC. The funding brought all kinds of opportunities. It was an absolute joy to work with Jane and Nadine, and I think we all benefited from the team that we put together. The funding allowed us to work with two wonderful postdoctoral researchers, Dr. Emma Walcon and Dr. Molly Flynn, whose insights, care and energy were really invaluable to the project. We were also fortunate to have some of the last two doctoral students funded by the HRC on a research project, and they made a terrific contribution to our thinking and to the shape of the project as a whole. The now Dr. Sarah Penny, who worked on amateur theatre in the Navy, and Dr. Cara Gray, who did a PhD on backstage work in the Garden City movement, and their work really enriched our thinking in so many different ways. I'm now going to hand over to Jane, who's going to talk about other people who enriched our thinking as we developed the project.
Thanks, Helen. Yes, just to sort of share some of the voices that we were in dialogue with of kind of other scholars who've been working in cognate areas. So historically, we were thinking about the work of Kate Newey, who'd been working on amateur in the 19th century as an enabling space for women playwrights, and also on Judith Hawley's work on dilettante aristocrats and all the shocking things they got up to in their amateur theatricals, and on her project with Mary Isbell on different settings for private theatricals of all types. And we were also drawing on other scholars who charted this longer history of amateur participation in the UK. I think in particular of Claire Cochrane's work and her look at amateur theatre groups as neglected zones of regional or national theatrical identity, and her work on sort of folding the amateur into a much longer study of kind of the rise of the theatrical industry in the 20th century in the UK. And also, of course, looking at Michael Dobson's work on Shakespeare and amateur performance, and considering the attraction and challenges of Shakespeare for amateurs, and also the soft power of amateur Shakespeare as a colonial project. And of course, Stacey Wolf, who taught us a lot about the pleasure and fun of all of those 20th century amateur musical shows in the US. And as well as those were looking specifically at amateur theatre, we were also in dialogue with kind of comparative work in music and dance and crafts, and in thinking around some sociological perspectives, although we found ourselves somewhat more in tension, I think, with those. But we were thinking about Richard Sennett work, the craftsman, and also Stebbins' work on serious leisure. And in turning to our project that was looking very specifically at recent and 20th century experience of amateur theatre in England, we were wanting to look more specifically at those questions of community rather than individual, and at those communities of shared practice that Helen was talking about. And that involved researching with those communities in rather interesting ways, as I'll pass over to Nadine to talk a little bit more about.
Thanks, Jane. Yes, we were really keen to hear from those who made amateur theatre, and we were also inspired by Sarah Pink's work on the emplaced ethnographer. So we wanted to be in the room and experience amateur theatre firsthand. So we went to rehearsals, we went to committee meetings, we went to costume and prop making sessions, set building, as well as performances and competitive festivals, and very interestingly, training days for adjudicators. And we tried kind of throughout the process to capture the real texture of making, of theatre as a creative and a situated and relational practice. So we invited amateur theatre makers to tell stories from evocative objects, to talk to us as they toured us around their theatres and their making spaces. Helen reenacted a script of an old pantomime with a group. We asked them to respond to photographs and documents that we found in the archives. And one particular memory I have, which I think encapsulates the approach we were trying to take, was sitting on a bed with Vivian Window, an elderly woman, as she talked me through her theatre archive. And it was a really intimate and affective moment, and an example of the immense generosity we experienced from the theatre makers we encountered. And in the book, we tried to accommodate some of these multiple voices, so interviews and record conversations sit alongside analytical work, and we tried to capture some of the immediacy of our responses in the room through extracts from our rehearsal diaries. So really try to kind of recognising that emplacement that we were engaged in, and also kept coming back to Erin Hurley's idea of the feeling work and acknowledging that and the emotional registers of the work that we were encountering. As a three, we worked collaboratively throughout, in terms of the book, taking the lead on chapters, but always feeding into each other's and developing things through dialogue. And we're trying to capture some of that spirit in this keynote. So three of us are now going to talk about different aspects of the research that we led on. Jane's going to begin on organisations and the repertoire, followed by Helen talking about places and placemaking. And then I'll pick up on what we learned from taking the material culture of amateur theatre seriously. And at the end, we'll come back together as a three and offer some concluding remarks.
Part of what we wanted to reflect on in the project and the book was how the organisations of amateur theatre developed as a movement in the 20th and 21st centuries, and to consider some of the consequences of this for our national theatrical life and our repertoires. Amateur theatre is a significant element of the diverse ways in which 21st century British theatrical life is organised and experienced. Over 1 million people participate each year. In England, there are more than 5,000 amateur theatre companies who regularly produce seasons of work, offering opportunities to make and experience live theatre performance all over the country. Fiona Dodd's study in 2008 found the turnover for youth schools and adult amateur theatre productions in England was £122 million. But the amateur theatre has not regularly figured in discussions of the cultural and creative industries. With the late 20th century rise of knowledge-based economies, there has been an increased individualisation of creativity, as Chris Bilton notes. Quote, "The individualistic, unaccountable logic of creativity has replaced the complexity of culture, and policymakers uncork the bottle of creativity, freeing creative individuals to weave their magic on the wider economy." Unquote. The creative industry needs creative individuals, and thus creativity itself is valued when it's operationalised for explicit economic benefits and outcomes. Now, within this rubric, amateur creativity, and thus amateur theatre, is cast as less culturally valuable, as primarily it is a collaborative activity and not directly related to arts and cultural markets. So, alongside rethinking ideas of the cultural economy, we turn to ideas of a cultural ecology to articulate what Anne Markson calls, quote, "the complex interdependencies that shape the demand for and production of arts and cultural offerings," unquote. And we've been thinking about amateur theatre as part of the diverse economies that Gibson Graham and Lation and Lee describe, of gifts and giving, of volunteer labour, of barter, household flows, communal assets and in-kind donation. And we've seen the very many ways in which volunteers give time to serve on amateur theatre committees, props are sourced from local businesses and costumes are recycled, as Nadine will talk about later. Gibson Graham note that these apparently marginal economic practices are more prevalent and account for more value produced than the commercial sector, unquote. Within this broader understanding, the value of amateur theatre can be configured as a dynamic part of a cultural ecology that enriches the cultural lives of communities. Today, many amateur theatre companies are affiliated to membership organisations NODA and the Little Theatre Guild, who with associations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland offer a national network of support and advocacy. And it was the founding of the two largest membership organisations, the National Amateur Operatic and Dramatic Association in 1899 and the now defunct British Drama League in 1919, that marked the rise of amateur theatre as a movement, as a sector, at the beginning of the 20th century, whose work contributed to the establishment of a national theatre culture. And I wanted to pick out three brief imbrications of the amateur movement in our cultural theatrical history. First, working in partnership with the commercial and subsidised sector, NODA and the British Drama League were central to the establishment of the National Theatre. Geoffrey Whitworth and the British Drama League re-energised the campaign for a national theatre after the First World War, including running a competition for architectural designs in country life in 1924, and saw the programme through to the successful building of the theatre. Secondly, the rise of the repertory theatre movement, built on a burgeoning sense of regional identity and independence, was one in which amateur theatre makers were intimately connected. As Helen will discuss in more detail in a moment, amateur theatre organisations built, sustained and enhanced the theatre infrastructure of the regions. Many regional civic theatres developed out of amateur activity and continue to be supported financially by amateur hires and cross-subsidy. Post the Second World War, the Little Theatre Guild has sustained neglected theatre buildings, and today they win Heritage Lottery or Arts Council England funding to upgrade their disabled access or seating or technical equipment because they're recognised as key community assets. So working together, amateur and subsidised sectors have supported a regional infrastructure of associational spaces for theatre making that continues today. And finally, amateur theatre organisations were key to the development of theatre as cultural education for adults as well as children in Britain. Working with local government and the Carnegie UK Trust in the 1930s, they appointed county drama committees and advisors who worked alongside more progressive groups like the Workers' Education Association to demonstrate the value of drama participation for adults and in schools, and militated for drama as a subject of study in further and higher education. So the organisations of the amateur theatre movement and the theatre companies remain spaces that have contributed to and continue to celebrate our collective symbolic life, engaged with wider public debates as part of, as Chris Barn puts it, the cultural body politic of a community. In many places, amateur theatre is the leading provider of live performance, with well over 10,000 productions staged each year in England. We observed amateur theatres have been performing, curating, and indeed creating the national repertoire in ways that have perhaps not been fully recognised. We noted that amateur theatres support the production of existing playwrights, frequently championing new plays from them, that is, the first outing after their professional production. The amateur repertoire is not just of well-established plays, but the British Theatre Repertoire Report of 2013 found that 46% of amateur theatre productions were of new writing from professional playwrights. And actually there's something rather distinctive about the amateur. Of this, 42% of those new plays were written by women, which is, quote, a much higher proportion than in the professional theatre, unquote. Amateur productions ensure royalties and performing rights licenses that support playwrights long after short professional runs of their work has ceased. As Amanda Whittington remarks, whose successful music-filled dramas that tackle difficult subjects with many good roles for women and is much produced within the amateur sector, amateur productions are sustaining careers and keeping writers writing. If you look at the money and where the power lies in the industry, that's a sleeping lion. I don't think the sector realises how powerful it is in that way, unquote. As Yale's Zara Levy reminds us, quote, successful plays and playwrights achieve their prominence not simply because of their intrinsic merit, but because of the work of mediators who influence the trajectory of a playwright's career, unquote. And although Zara Levy misses the role of amateur theatre in building the national repertoire, works that we now consider canonical have come to be seen in that way, in part because of their production and support within the amateur sector. To look at just one example, Harold Pinter's Birthday Party was panned when it first opened in London in May 1958 and closed in less than a week. But it had its London resurrection in May 1959 by the Tavistock Rep Players, an amateur company at the Tower Theatre, Canterbury, and Pinter was involved with the casting. This was after Pinter had directed a version himself with Stephen Joseph at Birmingham, but the next outing for the play was Bolton Little Theatre's staging in 1959, and again Pinter came to oversee some rehearsals. So a significant part of the story of the Birthday Party's eventual absorption into the modern canon is the series of amateur productions that established the play alongside its mainstream production. Another mode of interaction with the national repertoire we noted was through repetition and endurance of certain kinds of repertoire. Amateur theatres build audience knowledge and capacity, not just in terms of building an audience going public or an appetite or building audience numbers, but in building audience expertise. Alongside interest from new works by playwrights, amateur theatre offers a palette of genres and modes of performance in comedy, musical theatre, farce, murder mystery, thriller, pageant, Shakespeare, classics and 20th century stalwarts. But Tracy Davis has pointed out that we should not downgrade this enduring repertoire simply because it's familiar, since it is the means by which, quote, audiences are habituated to understand combinations of performative tropes and then recognise and interpret others that are unfamiliar, so that the new may be incorporated into repertoire, unquote. This cultural process, what we might call repertoiring, where repetition and consistency help audiences to recognise and appreciate borrowing in influence, allusion and novelty in live performance, is a key part of forming a national repertoire. Indeed, this repertoiring is in fact the precondition for innovation, and it's another way in which we can see the amateur theatres at work on the national repertoire. Finally, amateur theatre produces a very wide range of new writing from within companies, developing new voices in different ways to the genres that are traditionally associated with new writing in the subsidised sector. One of the things that we noted was the recurrence of documentary or episodic writing that focuses on working class or local experience. One example pictured here. This is South Devon Players writer Laura Jay, who was working with local historian Nigel Voisey on developing Survivors of the Titanic in 2015, which used documentary sources from the inquiry to retell the story from below decks. So in our analysis, we've observed that although the cultural value of amateur theatre was not today a widely recognised component of our national cultural ecology, yet amateur theatre had contributed to the range and sustainability of live performance and was part of mediating and reinvigorating our national theatrical repertoire. So now I shall hand over to Helen and Nadine to focus on some of the ways in which that role connects to questions around placemaking and community.
The relationship between amateur theatre and creative placemaking runs really deep. As Nadine's already described, we found ourselves in all kinds of places during the course of this project. We watched rehearsals in drafty village halls. We took part in prop and costume making in garden sheds. We looked at archives in people's bedrooms, as well as observing all aspects of theatre making in some beautiful and well-equipped theatres run by amateurs. Creativity is a material practice, embodied and in place. In amateur theatre, this sense of place has particular resonance. It provides opportunities for local participants to make theatre, as Nadine will describe. But for many towns and villages, where professional theatre is inaccessible or expensive, amateur theatre is the major theatre provider. As Jane's already pointed out, there's an emphasis in cultural policy on the role of the arts in placemaking, and there's an ambition to encourage wide participation in the arts, particularly where activity is low. In many cultural policies, theatre making is conceived as a social intervention, and it responds to a deficit model of cultural activity that often ignores the long-standing contribution that amateur theatre companies make to their local communities. I wanted to give you a sense of the scale of amateur theatre, and you'll see at the top of the slide some remarkable statistics about the number of people who took part in amateur theatre in 2008. When we were finishing the book, I kind of conducted a little experiment, and I wanted to map the number of active amateur theatre companies that were existing in 2015 within a 5-mile radius of my home in South Buckinghamshire. And to my surprise, there were 18 active amateur theatre companies, and I've listed them there with the dates in which they were founded. Our focus was primarily on theatre making rather than theatre audiences, and we wanted to raise some political questions about how different forms of amateur creativity are valued and understood in relation to place, including workplaces, and how this has changed over time. Part of the inspiration for the research came from cultural geographers who investigated the politics of creativity in spatial terms. Tim Edensaw and Steve Milliton's concept of vernacular creativity, first captured in 2009, was influential in shaping our thinking. And when they revisited this idea in 2019, this is what they wrote. We wanted to embrace marginal, unsexy, and less than glamorous, unspectacular creative practices and reveal their role in enhancing the lives of people in everyday spaces to offer a more powerful and inclusive analysis of creativity and place. All too often, such endeavours are maligned by arguments based on class-orientated values that champion certain forms of creative production in contradistinction to those that are not judged to be cool, sophisticated or fashionable. Embarking on a project on Amdram, I think that this idea of what is cool and not cool and how that relationship is to place and class-based politics spoke to us. And we similarly wanted to decenter the idea of creative practice. So the argument I'd like to pursue in this section is informed by this idea of amateur theatre and place as decentered in the cultural lexicon. The example that I've chosen to focus on here is the Garden City movement, which we said earlier was a case study. It provided a really useful case study because it's got a utopian idealism about it, in which amateur theatre was at the centre of cultural policy in its early days in the early 20th century. The energy and vision for amateur theatre lay with a man called C.B. Purdom, who was a pioneer, and he saw amateur theatre as a way to unite a new community in both Letchworth Garden City and Welwyn, the first two garden cities. He was a passionate advocate for amateur theatre, but he could also be found in the local newspaper making a case for why people should come to his performances and venting his frustration that the people of Letchworth did not turn out en masse to see his production of Tolstoy's Ivan the Fool. To Purdham's credit, he and his friends wrote and staged a pantomime in 1910 in which they tackled this issue head on. They lampooned themselves as the arty party with a misplaced missionary zeal that aimed to convert the masses to high art. And as Nadine has said, over 100 years later, I took the script back to Letchworth to see what the 2014 pantomime cast made of it. They read the script, and Peter Wright, who is an electrician in Letchworth and fifth-generation resident, commented as followed. It's just the same now as it was in 1910. Worse, the arty party today are pushing what we like to one side. We have lost the place we've always performed our panto, and then they spend money on fancy artists coming from Belgium. There was a meeting that they said was consultation, but it wasn't. I didn't feel respected. I went home feeling angry and a bit ashamed of what we do. This approach to cultural policy risks devaluing the taste of amateur theatre makers and maintaining established cultural hierarchies. Perhaps this is akin to Imogen Tyler's description of stigma, where she writes, "What stigma devalues are the people and places where they live. What stigma destabilizes our local communities and social bonds." That said, Letchworth's Heritage Foundation tried to reach a compromise by offering amateur theatres free rehearsal space, whilst also pursuing their ambition to become a town known for its international arts provision. In common with Peter, for many amateur theatre makers, attachment to place is symbolised by an attachment to their theatre buildings and places of performance. Cara Gray, who I said earlier undertook her PhD on this project, described amateur theatre makers as biographically bound to the buildings where they meet and perform. I certainly found this in discussion with Judy Claxton, who's been a member of the Barn Theatre in Welwyn Garden City since 1969, and this is what she says about her experiences there. I moved to Welwyn as a young bride in 1969. There are no cosy corners in the Garden City, and at first I was a bit daunted, but I liked its good socialist principles, so I went to the Barn and immediately felt at home. Oh yes, there's great affection for the Barn. We give our time and care, but if someone's being paid, where does it stop? Amateurs like to be amateurs. We don't want to be told what to do by someone who's being paid. You give your time and theatre's your love. Paying people to make costumes or build sets would disrupt the ecosystem. The longevity of creative association with one theatre company is not unusual in the amateur sector. We also found that amateur actors enjoyed seeing a different side to themselves, whether this was performing in their town or in their workplace. Amateur theatre was an important part of many workplaces until relatively recently, and one place where it survives is in the British Airways Cabin Crew Entertainment Society, BACSIS. Colette Lucas, who's a performer in the company, described her relationship between work and her identity in the panto. I love flying, and being cabin crew is an amazing experience, but you're also a bit samey. We all look alike, and there's not a lot of scope for being individuals when we're actually at work. Being in backseas gives me the chance to be noticed and seen differently. It's a time to be free. This idea of being seen differently in the workplace and the relationship between the workplace and amateur theatre has got a long history, and CEDOS, which started as the Stock Exchange Dramatic and Operatic Society, was founded in 1905, and it still maintains its links with the city. The company has a long-standing commitment to inclusivity and diversity, and it's interesting that this is the company where I found the most Black and global majority members. This reflects the global city and how socially privileged and mobile workforce integrate into city life. Other city-based amateur theatre companies found a different relationship between place and identity. Birmingham's Acting Out LGBTQ+ Theatre, Manchester's Jewish Theatre Group, and Philippine Theatre UK in London all engage with particular kind of communities and attachment to place. But most amateur theatre takes place in towns and more rural areas, where there's a less diverse population and a more complex relationship to inclusion. And I wanted to reflect for a moment on what John Garland and Neil Chakraborty write about rural racism, which they see in cultural terms. Often, it appears that white rural communities expect minority ethnic households to adopt the pre-existing and essentially white English cultural, social and religious norms that characterise village life. The longevity of membership of amateur theatre and its rootedness to place can mean that it seems reluctant to change and can appear more welcoming on the inside than it does on the outside. But I think there are changes afoot. Sheringham's Little Theatre responded to the Black Lives Matter movement via a project called Rewriting Rural Racism, which was led by the young people in that company. They designed it as a springboard project, which they hope will enable Sheringham's Little Theatre to build a more racially inclusive programme in their work. And I will end with this as an image.
In my part of this keynote, I want to focus on how amateur theatre as an activity and set of social processes might be accessed by its material culture. People who participate in amateur theatre very often keep mementos of performance squirreled away under beds, in attics, garages and cupboards. Programmes, posters, photos, designs, prompt copies, old props and bits of costume are kept as part of a compendium of lived moments, residues of performances that are long gone but held in the memory. Many theatre groups with their own theatres or access to storage facilities have props and costume stores stuffed to the rafters with materials waiting to be reused or recycled. The vast majority of research concerned with material culture focuses predominantly on the exchange and circulation of commodities and the ascription of value to those commodities via reference to ideas of use, money or labour. However, Arjun Appadurai refers to the social life of things, which have no meaning apart from those that human transactions, attributions and motivations endow them with. There's also been a growing body of work concerned with how individuals and things co-produce each other in a complex web of interdependence that Ian Hodder refers to as entanglement. And in his book Stuff, Daniel Miller proposes a dialectical theory of material culture through which objects make us as part of the very same process by which we make them. During our research, we were particularly inspired by Sherry Turkle's collection Evocative Objects, which explores how objects are indelibly connected to who we are, how we understand ourselves, and serve as valuable provocations to thought. She writes, "We find it familiar to consider objects as useful or aesthetic, as necessities or vain indulgences. We are on less familiar ground when we consider objects as companions to our emotional lives or as provocations to thought." The notion of evocative objects brings together these two less familiar ideas, underscoring the inseparability of thought and feeling in our relationship to things. I want to explore some of these ideas via 3 examples of material culture to explore what they can tell us about the practice of amateur theatre making. Narrowing my focus to the materiality of costume, I'm alert to how, as Aoife Monk's work reminds us, thinking about how and by whom costume is made and worn can offer us new paradigms for thinking about the theatre event, its social relations, and the conditions in which it is made. It became clear to us that making amateur theatre helps to shape subjectivities, and this was especially apparent during a conversation with John Beglin, who attended one of our Evocative Objects workshops at Questors Theatre in London, led by Erin Walken. Here, we invited people to attend with objects that captured memories and stories of their experience in amateur theatre. John Beglin arrived wearing one of his richly decorated costumes. He'd learnt to love sewing whilst at school, but recalled having been bullied for this emasculating activity. Now, in his late 50s and a chauffeur by trade, His craft practice with Philippine Theatre UK provided him a creative outlet to maintain and celebrate this aspect of his identity. His story is not unique. Many spoke to us about amateur theatre as a nourishment for a dimension of their personality that may not have been fully realised in the professional or domestic arenas they inhabit. As such, making amateur theatre plays a role in crystallising a sense of self in relation to others. Individuals became known as the one who does amateur theatre, and it's common for people to get associated with particular acting or backstage roles that they perform. For John Beglin, his identity is indelibly tied to his ability to tease an idea into being, to work out the practicalities of construction, select materials, sew costumes from scratch, embellish designs and repurpose pre-existing items found in charity shops or donated by members. His capacity to take pleasure and pride from problem solving and finding creative solutions is palpable, as this quote on the screen suggests. Korn suggests that crafted objects become talismans that independently confirm their owner's central narratives of personal identity, and this was clearly the case for the costumes John Beglin made. Speaking to him recalled Richard Sennett's elevation of the creative fulfilment attached to doing a job well for its own sake by applying craftsmanship with care and skill. When John Beglin referred to himself as the cat who gets the cream in terms of his work doing amateur theatre, it was because he had found a vehicle that enabled him to enact a craftsman-like approach to costume design, and in turn, this contributed to the ongoing process of bringing himself into being through making. John Manley from Toad's Theatre in Torquay arrived at another of our evocative objects workshops in Worcester's Swan Theatre with a pair of check trousers from the 1970s, which, although he humorously declared burning is probably too good for them, he had worn for 6 out of the past 7 summer shows produced by the company. Regardless of whether John Manley had played a villainous or heroic figure, the 2 sizes too big trousers had remained a constant fixture, and for him a permanent emblem of the economic precarity of amateur theatre making. He said, "I rarely consider them the epitome of amdram. They illustrate all that we have to cobble together, whether it be props that are constructed from blue tack and string, or ladies' ankle boots made from socks with a cut-out heel. The trousers shout, 'I have no money,' or certainly very little money. They perform a task. Whether good or not is debatable, but they do." So for John Manley, these trousers could be read very much in terms of apodurize the social life of things, and that they reveal something of the economic conditions within which amateur theatre functions, of limited resource, making do, cobbling together. Equally, material traces can tell us something of the creative ingenuity that arises from such limited resource. Many costume designers and makers for amateur groups talk through the various processes of unpicking and restitching, adding panels, shortening, lengthening, taking in, taking out, changing buttons, adding epaulettes that consistently preoccupied their role as a limited number of costumes are reused and recycled. A practice that recalls Igor Kopotov's idea of the biography of things, the ways in which objects or things have life histories or biographies, which acknowledges the way in which, like humans, material culture can have a particular life course where things may change their use and meaning over time. In this photograph, you'll see 3 cowboy costumes hanging in Fisher Hall, which is situated on HMS Excellent on Whale Island in Portsmouth, which is home to the Navy Command headquarters and training sites. The photo is taken in the mill room, which is a space lined with photographs tracing the history and heritage of the naval base, the gunnery, marching bands, its long time as a site for a naval zoo, housing animals that were gifted as mascots for ships. As an active naval base, this is not a space open to the general public, but it is the home of the Admiral's Players, an amateur theatre group comprised of serving and military of defence personnel and members of the local community. They produce 2 shows a year, a spring production and a pantomime. For Tim Stoneman, a long-time member of the group, the appeal is the social relationality it facilitates. He says, "It brings together a number of people, which the Navy doesn't always do. It brings together civilians and military in a social environment. It's a setup where you can have fun with people that you wouldn't necessarily ordinarily associate. So it's a vehicle for bringing together new coalitions of people to intermingle and create together. As this photo demonstrates, the insertion of amateur theatre, albeit temporarily, opens up and complicates this highly militarised space, its looming hyper-masculinized overtones and the rigidly hierarchical roles associated with this environment. The camp aesthetic of the heavily fringed cowboy suit costumes sits in complex juxtaposition with the images of the tightly choreographed costuming and presentation of military personnel that forms the backdrop. Seeing the photographs through the optics posed by the cowboy costumes highlights the performativity of identity and the dual versions of theatricality at play here. As I hope these brief insights have shown, we have found that taking amateur theatre's material traces seriously reveals a great deal about what it means to make amateur theatre for individuals, companies and communities. In the closing section of this talk, we will highlight some of the ways that the amateur and amateur theatre has been reconfigured and responded to the 21st century through the rise of the amateur as cultural icon, international networks, and innovative practice.
So you've heard from the three of us about particular areas of focus that we were looking at during the project, but perhaps we can come back together for a moment in dialogue as a three to just think about, so where does this leave us, and to reflect for a little bit about ways forward now. Our investigation into amateur theatre organisations and practices and the way that we can just begin perhaps to the amateur inching into arts public policy in the UK is paralleled elsewhere internationally. So Amateo, the European Participatory Arts Network, ran a huge survey and report on amateur participation and community building in the last couple of years, and IATA, the International Amateur Theatre Association, has also been busy networking and linking groups and driving this new sense of interest in what amateur theatre can do for us and for communities. And also through the International Federation of Theatre Research, we've seen an amateur research group develop, and they're looking in particular at amateur practices in small nations and community building in those contexts. Elsewhere, we've reflected on some of the really diverse ways that amateur theatre plays out, on the kind of lineages of amateur theatre elsewhere. In some nations, it's really an avant-garde innovation, a politically resistant form. Elsewhere, it's a conservative cultural force centred perhaps more on cultivation or education, or even as preserver of traditional or endangered cultural forms. So one of the things that strikes us overall about the value and significance of studying amateur theatre is that as a set of practices, there's a real complexity about what it stands for and how it operates in diverse international settings. And that's maybe one of the things where we can see future work and research going for the future. But in terms of thinking about the future and innovation, pass over to you, Nadine, because you've been looking at that.
Thanks, Jane. Yes, I mean, we all know that there's a well-worn stereotype of amateur theatre as stuffy and old-fashioned, but there's really loads of examples of companies rising to the multiple challenges posed by the 21st century and demonstrating actual considerable flair, innovation and future thinking. In response to the climate emergency, Titchfield Festival Theatre have tackled ecological and economic sustainability head on and have become the first fully carbon neutral amateur theatre. Many theatres have been live streaming in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and producing digital programmes, even some bar apps so that people can get their drinks during the intervals. And the response to the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements have also been marked, with companies asking tough questions about their predominantly white memberships, barriers to inclusion, and championing what diversity can do for theatre. And these issues have been debated and circulated by the Little Theatre Guild and at the National Drama Festivals Association conference this year. So this is not to suggest, however, that there isn't a huge amount to do to address anti-exclusion policies and practice in amateur theatre. but there's a notable investment in challenging unquestioning approaches, I think, and looking for ways to invigorate and diversify casting and repertoires and directorial practice. And this openness is also kind of evident in what Helen is going to talk about now in terms of where the amateur is in the broader kind of context of society.
Thanks, Nadine. When we designed the research project, we felt we had to put parameters around it, and one of the parameters was that we looked at amateur theatre in England, recognising that there are different traditions in the UK, but also in different parts of the world. But I think one of the things that we've seen as we became more immersed in this area is that the amateur is really something of a 21st century cultural icon and emerging towards that. There's an amateur turn. We've seen amateur celebrities on the television who are kind of taking part in cooking programs and so on. And I think that consolidates the idea of the amateur not as somebody who doesn't know stuff, but as an expert. And one of the things that we found throughout was that the amateurs that we met really wanted to be experts in their craft, and I think that relationship between the amateur and expertise is something that has perhaps been overlooked, that we found in the sector. So the amateur turn, I think, is embracing a whole range of different media. It's found in all kinds of different contexts, and I think it's just important to say that actually we're all amateurs at something, and that how the amateur is seen needs to be regarded in that way. One of the things that I'm picking up on in future research is the role of amateur theatre in towns, and we're seeing at the moment a big emphasis in cultural and political policy on towns, which is where a lot of amateur theatre takes place. So I think this amateur turn is something that we can embrace and celebrate amateurs as experts, and we hope this keynote has given you some insights into the way in which we've been thinking about this. Thank you very much.